Hey guys, tonight, we're about to step into the mysterious fire-lit world of Viking funeral ships. Imagine this. You're standing on the shore, the sound of waves softly lapping against the land, the scent of smoke from a distant pyre drifting on the evening breeze. In front of you, a longship rests on a bed of dry grass, its wooden planks darkened by age, yet ready to carry its last passenger on a journey to the unknown. The fire is already crackling, and you can feel the weight of ritual in the air. You're about to witness a Viking send-off like no other, a journey not just through the fjords, but into the afterlife itself. Oh, and just a heads up, you probably won't survive this, but we'll get to that. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling adventurous, post your location and the time where you're tuning in from. It's always nice to know where you're all at. Now dim. The lights maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air feels different around Viking funeral ships, like something between a storm and a prayer. You watch as figures in dark, fur-lined cloaks move about preparing the ship for its final mission. The sounds are low and solemn, but not without purpose. The ships aren't just for crossing water. They're built to carry someone, usually someone important, on their final voyage. This wasn't a trip to a faraway island or a port across the sea. No, this was a trip to the afterlife, guided by flames' chants, and perhaps the gentle hum of the wind if you're lucky. But what does it mean to be a Viking elite, chosen for such a send-off? Well, not just anyone gets to take this ride. In fact, the selection process was as brutal and intense as the warriors themselves. A Viking chieftain noble, or even a well-loved warrior, might find themselves at the head of this ceremony. But it wasn't just about fighting prowess. It was about leaving a legacy that would be remembered in the flickering glow of firelight. The wealth, power, and respect earned in life had to be carried into death, and the ship, the vessel, was the ideal symbol of this transition. So who are these chosen ones? The names of the greatest Viking leaders and warriors certainly echo down through history. Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway, for example. But others, they weren't just military men. The Viking world was complex, layered with family ties, political alliances, and religious rituals. And each one of these made the final choice of who got a Viking ship send-off. You can picture it now, a long ship filled with treasure food, and sometimes animals all placed on the vessel to ensure that the deceased had everything they needed for the journey ahead. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. What did the ship look like? And how did it all come together? Let's take a closer look at what happened during the construction of these death vessels. The long ship that's waiting for its final journey is not just any boat. This is a craft of meticulous design, made to float on both the calm and the stormy seas, designed for both warfare and the crossing into eternity. It's not just about wooden planks and iron nails. This ship has been carefully crafted to carry its passenger beyond the veil, towards a Viking afterlife, where warriors feast forever in Valhalla, or perhaps a different kind of paradise, depending on the beliefs of the time. As you look closer, you notice something, the intricate details that make this ship special. Long ships were not only beautiful, but practically designed to be fast and light. Their hulls were narrow, flexible, and shallow, perfect for navigating the turbulent waters of the Scandinavian fjords. The sleek, curved lines of the hull and the bright colors of the painted shields along the sides give the ship a certain elegance. But there's something more going on here. This was a ship that would have to carry its passenger through a kind of liminal space, partway between this world and the next. But to get to this point, there were months, sometimes years of careful planning. You might have watched skilled shipbuilders carve the wood, sanding each piece until it fit perfectly, with the next using tools that haven't changed in centuries. Each piece had meaning, every curve and cut holding symbolic significance, not just for the gods, but for the dead themselves. Perhaps the shipbuilders hummed as they worked, knowing that their labor wasn't just for war or transport. It was for a soul's eternal journey. The construction of a Viking funeral ship was far from a small undertaking. It wasn't like a quick roadside craft. No, this was an investment. The process could take months or even years, depending on the size and grandeur of the ship. Some Viking chiefs had long ships built that could reach up to 30 meters long with 30 or more rows of oars. That's right, 30 oarsmen per side, rowing in perfect sync. Their strength echoed in the ship's steady rhythm. But when it was all said and done, the ship would be ready to carry its passenger on their final journey, whether it would sail through the fjords or burn under a midnight sky. Still, there's a curious side to Viking ships that historians still argue about. For example, why was it so important to create these massive ships just to set them on fire or bury them in the ground? Some say it was because the ship was seen as a kind of conduit one that carried the deceased over a vast watery divide to another world, a world that was both known and unknown. But others believe that these ships were meant to show the wealth and power of the dead, a kind of statement about their status in life. Who's right? Historians have been debating this for years. But let's get back to the ship itself. The Viking funeral ship wasn't just about the ship. It was a complete package. Once the vessel was ready, it was time to fill it up. And that's where the fun starts, because what went inside these ships is as interesting as the ship itself. You can almost see it now, layers of possessions carefully packed inside the longship. The ship isn't just a boat anymore. It's an entire world in miniature filled with objects, meant to ensure the comfort and success of the deceased in the afterlife. But it's not just about what they take with them. It's about what they leave behind, too. To start, there's always treasure. We're talking gold, silver, intricate weapons, jewelry things that might make a Viking warrior look like he's about to march into battle one last time. But don't think this was all show. In Viking culture, wealth wasn't just for this life. It was for the next. You see, the Vikings believed that in the afterlife, one would need these things, whether it was to show off to the gods, to settle into their new home, or to arm themselves in case they were called to fight again. In fact, Vikings believed that those who died in battle would be given a place in Valhalla, where they would continue their warrior's life, fighting by day and feasting by night. But what about the less glorious deaths? Well, those still got a place in Viking mythology, just in a different part of the afterlife, where the deceased would be prepared for a different kind of eternity. Whatever the case, the deceased were never to journey empty-handed. And then, there are the animals. You didn't think that the Vikings were going to leave their horses behind, did you? Some Viking burial ships were found with horses, dogs, and even other domestic animals placed inside the vessel with the deceased. These animals would accompany their master to the afterlife, ready to continue their journey together. But there's a strange element to this practice. Was it only for the elite? What about slaves or prisoners? In some cases, there are reports of people being sacrificed and placed on the ship with their masters, either to serve them in the afterlife or as part of the ritual. Historians are still torn on how common this was. Some suggest that only the highest-ranking individuals would have this luxury, while others think it may have been a way to send off those who had been closest to the deceased in life. You're probably wondering, what about everyday things? Well, it wasn't just about gold and horses. Some Viking ships contained everyday items like tools, weapons, clothing, and food, things you'd expect to need on a long journey. It's clear that the Vikings believed in practicality, but they also wanted the deceased to feel comfortable, as if they were just sailing off for a long, leisurely trip. Historians still argue over whether everything packed on the ship was meant to symbolize what the deceased would use in the afterlife, or if it was simply a status symbol, an attempt to show how much the dead had achieved in life. Maybe a little bit of both. But if you're looking for something really strange, let's talk about the human cargo. What we know for sure is that Viking ships occasionally carried not only possessions, but also people. There were those who were sacrificed to accompany the deceased on their final journey. This practice wasn't just reserved for those of royal blood. It could involve warriors, slaves, or even young women. The specifics remain cloudy, but the idea that someone would be sent off with their ruler or loved one in this dramatic way wasn't all that unusual. Historians debate how common this practice was. Some claim it was ceremonial, while others argue it was just a horrific reality for the underclass. Either way, it adds a chilling element to the ritual one that still sparks questions today. You might be wondering at this point if we're going to see any of these ships set sail. Well, hold on, because it's almost time. But first, let's take a look at the peculiar and very theatrical aspects of this journey and the rituals that surrounded it. Now imagine the night has finally arrived. The longship is ready, and you can hear the low murmur of voices as the ritual begins. The Viking funeral wasn't just a simple burial. It was an event, a spectacle. This wasn't something you rushed through. No, this was a carefully choreographed ceremony, one that blended solemnity with ritual drama. The ship would not just sail away or burn quietly. It would be accompanied by chants, prayers, and sometimes even music rituals, designed to send the deceased off in the most powerful way possible. You might be standing on the shore, watching the preparations unfold. The scent of smoke from the torches fills the air, and the glow from the firelight casts eerie shadows across the water. There are mourners, certainly, but there's something else too. Some people are there to witness the grand event, perhaps family and friends, or even the local community, all gathered to witness this transition into the afterlife. But what's most curious is the involvement of the audience. The Vikings didn't just perform the funeral for the deceased. They performed it for everyone else too. It was a public event in which the community could express their respect, their grief, and their belief in what would come next. Historians have argued that Viking funerals were meant to serve as a sort of collective reaffirmation of Viking values, bravery, strength, loyalty, and the promise of an afterlife. It was also a way to showcase the deceased's status. You wouldn't expect a simple farmer to get the same kind of farewell as a chieftain or warlord. But what does it mean when the rituals feel more like a public performance than a private, intimate moment? Was it for the dead, or was it for the living, to witness the ritual they believed in so strongly. That's a debate still swirling among scholars. Now imagine the boat is lit. The flames leap into the night sky, and for a moment the whole world seems consumed by light. The ship, once a home for the deceased, now begins to burn. The flames crawl over the wood, licking the sides of the vessel as it starts to sink into the dark waters. But wait, here's something that's not always clear in the pictures and stories you've heard. It wasn't always about the ship burning. Sometimes Viking funeral ships were simply left to rot, or were buried entirely. Some ships were so large that they couldn't fit into the rivers or seas, so they were placed on land, sometimes even under mounds of earth. In other cases, the ship was filled with stones and sank into the water, but not before it was stripped of its precious cargo, leaving only the ashes to tell the tale. Historians still argue over whether the ship burning was the most common practice. Some scholars suggest that cremation wasn't the rule. Rather, burial in the ship was often the more common and practical solution. The burning itself may have been more symbolic an effort to send the deceased out to sea, in a metaphorical sense. The contrast of the fire against the still water, the glow of the flames flickering on the horizon, it's all part of the grand story of a soul embarking on an eternal journey. But if the fire wasn't always the dramatic climax, what was? There were, of course, those cases where the ship didn't burn at all. Instead, Viking burial sites sometimes featured a massive ship grave, where the ship would be placed on land or in a burial mound, carefully arranged with its contents, and left there as a permanent symbol of the deceased's journey. These were still rituals of remembrance and respect, though not always carried out with the fire and flame you might expect. And yet, despite all the drama, something about the ship remained. The object, the longship, had transcended its original purpose of simply being a vessel for war or trade. It had become a vessel for the dead. To this day, some Viking burial ships are still unearthed, revealing treasures, tools, and clues about how these mighty people understood life and death. But that's a different part of the story. Before we move on, let's take a moment to consider the slightly eerie idea of ship burials without water and what they might have symbolized. Not all Viking burial ships sailed or even touched water. Some were meant to be permanent monuments, a final resting place that would last long after the body was gone. Now imagine you're standing next to a burial mound in the heart of a Viking village, where there's no water in sight, just the earth beneath your feet. In front of you lies a massive, oddly shaped mound, as tall and wide as a house built to resemble a longship. But this isn't a ship meant to sail. It's a symbolic ship, one that was never intended to float on water, but to sit forever on land. These are the burial ships without a journey. In fact, some of the most fascinating Viking burial sites aren't near any body of water at all. The practice of creating ship graves, land-based burial sites, shaped like ships, was surprisingly common in certain parts of the Viking world. You might think this seems counterintuitive. If ships are supposed to carry people over water, why would the Vikings go to all this effort to build ships that would never touch the sea? But the answer is rooted in Viking beliefs about the afterlife, in which the dead needed to travel to a distant otherworldly land. Perhaps they didn't need the water to reach that destination. Maybe the ship itself was just a powerful symbol, standing in for the journey that would never take place. Historians have long debated the role of these land-based ship burials. Some argue that the Viking people saw them as temporary markers, places for the dead to rest, before the final soul journey began. Others believe that they were meant to keep the spirits of the deceased in close proximity to the community, a way of honoring them without fully sending them away. Still others think that these ship graves might have been a ritualistic way to ensure that the spirit remained within the community, where its memory would be kept alive. After all, the Vikings didn't just honor the dead. They believed in maintaining their presence in the living world too. You're probably wondering, how did these ship graves work in practice? Well, the construction was incredibly complex. These ships weren't just hastily built mounds. They were carefully planned, often incorporating stone, timber, and soil. In some cases, the ships were constructed from stone slabs, arranged in the shape of a longship. In others, the mound itself was surrounded by a wooden or stone frame, which mimicked the shape of the vessel. These ship-like structures were then filled with the personal effects of the deceased tools' weapons, and sometimes even animal sacrifices. The mound became a lasting monument to a warrior or leader's life, their deeds forever captured in a stone and earth representation of the ship they would have sailed. Interestingly, while most people think of Viking burials as a strictly northern European practice, similar ship-shaped burial mounds have been found in other parts of the Viking world, such as in what's now Russia, and even parts of the British Isles. These land ships were just as important as their sea-bound counterparts, carrying their own set of rituals and meanings. The symbolism was universal across Viking lands, even if the practices of burial itself differed from region to region. But why were some ships built for burial and others for burning or sailing? Historians still argue about this point. Was there a difference in the beliefs of the people, depending on whether the ship would go out to sea or remain on land? Some scholars speculate that the difference was class-based. The richer, higher status individuals were given the grand fire burial, with a ship that would burn upon the waves, while the common folk were more likely to be buried in a landship mound. Others suggest that this distinction was based on regional variations in Viking customs. The debate continues, though one thing is clear: the ship was central to the Vikings' understanding of both life and death, whether it was sailing into the afterlife or staying rooted on the earth. While we'll never know exactly what was going through the minds of the Vikings when they chose to bury their dead with such elaborate rituals, one thing is certain: these ship burials were powerful, lasting symbols. The ships served as both physical markers of the deceased's journey and spiritual guides, ensuring that their passage to the next world was secure. And while the ships may not have always set sail, their significance was never in question. Now let's take a closer look at some of the more unusual cases in Viking burial history ships that went nowhere and yet carried much more than just the dead. As you stand there contemplating the eerie quiet of the land ship burial mounds, it dawns on you the Viking approach to death was a complex blend of practicality and myth. The ships were symbols, yes, but they were also highly functional. It's not just the burial itself that's fascinating. It's the strange details that surround these rituals. Viking burial sites are full of strange anomalies that make us question the very idea of what the Vikings were trying to achieve. Some ships seem to have been designed for an audience of gods, not just humans, and in a way, these strange burial mounds, sometimes called ship settings, reveal more about the Viking worldview than anything else. Take, for instance, the curious case of the Oseberg ship, found in Norway in 1904. This ship wasn't just buried in a mound. It was part of a grand burial complex. 2 women likely of high status were buried inside the ship, along with their belongings. The Oseberg ship itself is one of the most impressive Viking burial ships ever discovered. At over 21 meters long, it had a distinctly elegant design, unlike many other Viking ships. Scholars still debate whether the 2 women buried in the Oseberg ship were royalty or noblewomen, but what stands out is the ship's artistic and functional features. The intricately carved prow with its dragon head design hints at the kind of afterlife they believed awaited them, a world filled with grandeur, power, and even protection. The burial site itself tells us a lot about Viking beliefs. The ship was placed inside a large mound of earth, and it wasn't the only ship in the area. Nearby, there were other smaller ships and burial chambers, but the Oseberg ship was unique in that it included everything from textiles to animal bones, food, and even a variety of tools. It was in many ways a miniature version of the Viking world, a world meant to carry the deceased forward into their next life. But what's curious is that despite the wealth and elaborate setup, there's no evidence that this ship was ever intended to actually be burned. This opens up a whole new debate. Why bother with such an elaborate ship burial if there was no fire? Was the ship simply meant to be a permanent symbol, a lasting monument to these individuals' power and status? Historians argue that the Oseberg ship may have been designed for a different kind of journey, one that didn't involve fire or water at all. Perhaps it was a display, an offering to the gods, or even a burial meant to be seen by the living community as an act of divine favor. Others believe that it was a way to solidify the woman's power in death, ensuring that her legacy would live on forever, in a vessel that was more than just a functional tool. It was art. It was status. It was a story told in wood and bone. As fascinating as the Oseberg burial is, it's not the only one that stands out in Viking history. In fact, other burials challenge the very idea of ship graves altogether. In some places, ships were found buried with no occupants at all, or with people who were seemingly of lower status than you'd expect. In some cases, the ships were almost entirely stripped of valuables, tools, weapons, and food were absent. This lack of material wealth is puzzling to scholars, who argue that these ships might have been intended for a different kind of journey. But what could that be? Some theorists suggest that these ships may have been symbolic, serving as a ritualized boundary marker between the living and the dead. They weren't just vessels for transportation, they were vessels for transformation. Perhaps in some instances, the ships themselves were part of a ritual designed to help the soul transition to a different state, one where they would need nothing material, only spiritual protection. But before we dive deeper into these more unusual burial practices, there's another curious element to Viking funerals, the role of fire. It's widely believed that fire was a key element of Viking burial rites. But what if the ships didn't always burn? Historians still argue whether fire was essential for all Viking funerals. Were some of these grand ship burials, like the Oseberg ship intended for other rituals, entirely ones that didn't involve flames? To understand the full complexity of Viking funerary practices, we have to consider how fire itself worked within their rituals. We'll explore that next, as we dig into the strange and ritualistic relationship the Vikings had with fire, and how it shaped their view of the afterlife. You feel the crackling warmth of the fire as it dances in front of you, flickering and popping like it's alive, almost as though it has its own will. The Viking people were no strangers to fire. It was a tool, a weapon, a comfort, and above all, a symbol. When it came to funerary rituals, fire wasn't just a way to consume the body. It was a powerful force that bridged the gap between the living and the dead. For the Vikings, fire was the essence of transition. It was the heat that would guide the deceased through their journey into the afterlife. But fire wasn't always the centerpiece of every Viking funeral. While many might picture Viking ships ablaze on the open sea, the reality is that fire was often reserved for the highest-ranking individuals. It was a grand spectacle that reinforced the status of the deceased, marking them as warriors or leaders of great power. And this is where things start to get complicated, because while fire may have been the ritual of choice for some, it was not the only path to eternal rest. In fact, as strange as it might sound, not all Viking funeral ships were actually burned. Some were buried with the deceased inside them, while others were simply left to rot or decay. If you're picturing an abandoned ship slowly sinking into the sea, you're not far off. The ship itself wasn't always a vehicle for the body to burn into ash. Sometimes the ship was meant to act as a vessel for the soul, a protective casing to guide the spirit to its final resting place. Why the disparity historians still argue about it. Some believe that Viking leaders, the highest-ranking individuals, were more likely to receive the burning funeral, a fiery send-off to show their valor. But what about ordinary warriors or farmers? Were they left with less grandiose rites buried in the ship, without the flames licking the sky? The differences likely depend on the region, the era, and the status of the person being buried. Some scholars argue that it had more to do with what the surviving family could afford, rather than any formal religious decree. Others point out that burning was an essential part of the ritual of cleansing and transformation, and that only the very elite had the right to be set aflame. But it wasn't just about the fire itself. The flames were intended to serve as a kind of purifier, to burn away the impurities of life and usher the dead into the next world. The idea was that the fire helped the spirit depart from the body, ensuring that the soul could move on without being held back by physical remnants. The smoke, they believed, would carry the soul upwards toward the gods. This is why many Viking graves, especially those of important figures, were so carefully constructed to allow the flames to burn freely and guide the soul on its journey. In fact, there's evidence that some Vikings were buried with fire in mind. They may have placed stones around the burial site to contain the fire, or even added a layer of wood to ensure a long-lasting blaze. And while fire was often the final act, it wasn't the only act. Before the flames ever touched the ship, the body was often prepared in ways that might seem bizarre today. Some bodies were disemboweled and cleaned to ensure they would burn properly. Others were wrapped in cloths or placed inside large wooden coffins, part of an elaborate time-consuming ritual. Fire wasn't just about setting something alight. It was about preparing the deceased for their final passage. Yet, as with many Viking practices, there were variations based on geography and time period. In places like Scandinavia, it was more common for the ship to be set afloat, to burn under a grand sky, perhaps even accompanied by a feast music and chanting. In other regions, burial in the ship without fire seemed just as acceptable. Historians can't seem to agree on which version of the ritual was most authentic, but it's clear that fire played a significant role in this belief system. This brings us to a curious phenomenon: ship burials without fire. Yes, as strange as it might sound, not all Viking burial ships were meant to burn. Some were left standing their cargo, and the deceased buried in elaborate mounds, sometimes on land, sometimes near water, but without the flames to accompany them. These mounds were intended as eternal resting places, far from a fiery end. In these instances, the ship often became more of a permanent symbolic monument, rather than a temporary vehicle for transformation. In fact, some scholars suggest that the absence of fire in these cases might indicate a shift in Viking burial practices, perhaps influenced by changes in religion or social structures. There's even the suggestion that by burying a ship without burning it, the Vikings were preparing a sort of lasting afterlife, where the spirit could remain attached to the physical world in a more permanent way. Historians are still unsure why fire was such an integral part of some funerals, and not others. Was it a purely ritualistic choice, made based on the deceased's status? Or was it an indication of deeper shifts in Viking spiritual beliefs, as they slowly moved away from old ways and began to incorporate Christian ideas? The debate continues to this day. Whatever the case, fire had an undeniable role in shaping the Viking funeral, marking the transition from life to death. But whether the flames actually consumed the ship or not, the spirit was always thought to continue its journey, somewhere far beyond the reach of earthly understanding. Now that we've touched on the role of fire, let's explore a very specific type of Viking burial ritual, one that continues to intrigue archaeologists and historians alike: the boat graves. These are different from the ship burials we've discussed, and offer another layer to the complexity of Viking burial practices. You stand now at the edge of a remote cliff, looking out across the horizon, where the remains of a burial site silently await discovery. But this isn't just any burial. It's a boat grave, and it's unlike the ship burials we've already explored. These graves, deeply rooted in Viking tradition, tell an entirely different story. They're often found in unexpected places, rural fields atop hillsides, or even in the middle of ancient forests, far removed from the coastal lands you'd expect to find Viking ships. Instead of majestic longships or extravagant mounds, these graves were designed for the dead to remain intimately connected with the earth. At first glance, a boat grave might seem like an oxymoron. A boat, meant to be afloat buried underground, yet this was another part of the intricate tapestry of Viking funerary practices. The boats were carefully constructed, sometimes out of wood, sometimes using stone, or even a combination of both. They would be placed into shallow graves, often with the deceased's personal items arranged around them: tools, weapons, even animals. But unlike the grand ships set afloat or set ablaze on the water, these boat graves were grounded frozen in time, as quiet markers of Viking history. The most famous example of this boat grave phenomenon is found in the Gokstad ship, discovered in 1880 in Norway. This burial didn't involve fire, nor was it meant to sail. Instead, the boat was buried in a large mound, a monumental tribute to the dead. The Gokstad ship was a real masterpiece of Viking craftsmanship, nearly 23 meters in length, with a sleek, powerful design. But instead of sending this ship off into the sea or setting it ablaze, it was carefully interred in the earth. The body of the deceased lay in a large chamber within the boat, surrounded by the tools, goods, and animals that would accompany them to the afterlife. The mound above it was built with reverence, a final resting place, meant to honor the warrior who had once sailed the seas, only now the journey would end in the earth. Historians are still baffled by these boat graves, and they've sparked numerous debates. Was it purely about symbolism? After all, if the boat wasn't going to sail or burn, what purpose did it serve? Some suggest that these graves were an evolution of Viking burial practices, one that might have been more about permanence than ritual. After all, land-based graves were far less vulnerable to the whims of tides and waves. They were designed to endure, to stand the test of time. The boat, whether it ever sailed or not, represented the enduring journey of the spirit. But this time, it was meant to be a permanent tribute on solid ground. But what's truly perplexing is that these graves weren't reserved for the highest-ranking individuals. Yes, high-status Vikings, like the ones buried in Gokstad, received boat graves. But there's evidence suggesting that these graves were used by a wide range of people, perhaps warriors, but also farmers, artisans, and even lesser-known figures within the Viking world. Some scholars suggest that boat graves might have been a more democratic form of burial, open to various classes, whereas the grand sea-bound ship burials were reserved for the elite. There's also an eerie beauty in the fact that boat graves were often placed near water, suggesting that even if the ships never sailed, they still maintained a deep connection to the sea, the thing that shaped the Vikings' identity. It's as if the ships, even in death, needed to be in proximity to the water, as though the spirits would be closer to their old home. The concept of water, after all, was vital to Viking cosmology. The sea was the realm of the gods, the pathway to the afterlife, and often it was seen as a symbol of both life and death. While many of these boat graves remain unexplored or only partially excavated, what we do know is that the Vikings held these burials in deep reverence. The boat, whether it sailed, burned, or remained buried, was never just a vessel. It was a connection between worlds. To place a body inside a boat, even when lying still in the ground, was to send the dead on a journey into the great unknown, just as the Vikings once traveled the seas in life. So let's pause for a moment and imagine the quiet reverence around these boat graves. The earth, the wood, the stones, all carefully arranged to guide the spirit into its final resting place. These boats were not just markers of death, but representations of a culture that understood the journey wasn't always a simple one. Sometimes it was about endurance, about maintaining a connection to the world and the afterlife, no matter how far the journey seemed. Next, we'll move on to a particularly curious aspect of Viking burial practices, the sacrificial animals. There's much more to these offerings than meets the eye, and you might be surprised at how integral they were to the ritual of death. Now imagine a soft breeze rustling the leaves around you, the silence broken only by the distant sound of waves lapping against the shore. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the sound of hooves or paws, and the low murmur of a priest muttering a prayer. In Viking burial rites, animals weren't merely companions. They were sacrifices sent to accompany the dead on their final journey. Whether horses, dogs, or even falcons, these creatures were thought to be essential for guiding the soul to the afterlife, ensuring the deceased would not be alone. The practice of including animals in Viking burials was widespread, but it was particularly common for high-status individuals like warriors and nobles to be buried with their most treasured animals. The Oseberg ship burial, for instance, contained not just the bodies of 2 women, but also the remains of horses' dogs and even a peacock. For the Vikings, these animals weren't just for show. They believed the animals were essential for ensuring a smooth transition to the afterlife, where their spirits would be called upon to assist in the deceased's journey. There's a practical side to this as well. Horses, for example, were of great value to the Vikings. They weren't just transportation, they were an integral part of warfare agriculture and the Viking lifestyle. To bury a warrior with their horse was to ensure that they could ride again in the afterlife, ready to face the battles or challenges ahead. And the connection between the Viking warriors and their horses was strong. These animals weren't merely tools, they were companions in battle, sharing in the victories and defeats. The bond between rider and steed was as strong in death as it had been in life. Historians argue that the inclusion of horses wasn't just symbolic. The Vikings were profoundly connected to their animals, viewing them as spiritual guides. They believed that these creatures could help carry the soul across the boundaries of life and death. Some scholars suggest that the animal sacrifices were meant to act as a bridge between the world of the living and the afterlife, ensuring that the deceased wouldn't be left to wander alone in the afterlife's unknown realms. Interestingly, while we mostly hear about horses and dogs in these burials, the role of other animals is often overlooked. Some burials, such as the Birka Cemetery in Sweden, have revealed the remains of birds, fish, and even bears. What's particularly fascinating is the inclusion of birds like falcons. Birds were often associated with Odin, the chief of the Viking gods, who was known for his 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, who flew across the world, gathering information for their master. Perhaps the birds in these burials were meant to accompany the dead, in the same way that Odin's ravens accompanied him, keeping watch over the soul, and ensuring it reached its final destination. Of course, not all Viking burials featured animals, especially for those of lower status. For the common Viking, such elaborate rituals were often beyond reach. But that didn't mean animals weren't still present in some form. Some individuals might have been buried with animal-shaped talismans or charms representing the protective qualities they believed the animals possessed. And the idea of animal sacrifice wasn't just about status. It was a deeply ingrained spiritual belief in the interconnectedness of humans and the natural world. Historians have long debated the specifics of these sacrifices. Some believe the animals were killed as part of a ritual to serve the deceased in the afterlife, while others suggest they were meant to provide comfort, companionship, or protection on the journey to the other side. Still others point out that in some Viking cultures, animals like dogs or horses were believed to serve as psychopomps beings that guide souls to the afterlife. It's likely that there was no single answer. Instead, the inclusion of animals in Viking burials could have been based on various factors: social status, regional practices, and even the individual's personal connection to their animals. But the animals didn't always have to be dead to play a part in Viking funerals. There's evidence to suggest that in some cases, living animals were sacrificed at the gravesite, perhaps to join the deceased on their journey. In fact, one of the most famous Viking sacrifices took place at the Uppsala Temple in Sweden, where it is said that 9 animals, horses, dogs, and even humans were sacrificed to ensure a good harvest or a successful battle. It's clear that the Vikings saw animals as vital to the well-being of the dead in ways we may not fully understand today. They were more than offerings or companions. They were sacred beings, intermediaries between the living and the divine. To be buried with an animal was a powerful statement not just of wealth, but of a belief in the interconnectedness of all living creatures and the divine forces that governed the cosmos. As we delve deeper into Viking burial customs, we'll next explore the mysterious and often controversial human sacrifices that sometimes occurred alongside these animal rites. These grisly offerings, whether real or imagined, are part of the enduring myth of the Vikings, and while they're controversial, they also highlight just how deeply the Vikings were willing to go to ensure the safe passage of their loved ones. Imagine for a moment the cold, solemn air of a Viking burial site, with the wind howling through the trees, whispering secrets of the past. The earth is dark and silent, yet beneath the surface, there's a grim and unsettling history waiting to be uncovered. Human sacrifice. It's a topic that sends shivers down the spine, and it's been at the heart of Viking mythology for centuries. The very thought of a human being killed in the name of ritualistic practice is enough to invoke feelings of horror, but in Viking society, it wasn't just an act of brutality, it was a spiritual necessity. Historians have long debated whether human sacrifices were part of Viking burial practices, or merely sensationalized tales passed down by later generations. But evidence suggests that in certain circumstances human sacrifices did indeed occur. For the Vikings, these acts were meant to ensure that the soul of the deceased could travel safely to the afterlife. In the harsh, unpredictable world they inhabited, ensuring the passage of the dead was of paramount importance. Whether it was to appease the gods, ensure victory in battle, or guarantee prosperity, the Vikings believed that sacrifices were a way to forge a direct connection to the divine. The most famous example of Viking human sacrifice comes from the Uppsala Temple in Sweden, a religious site dedicated to the Norse gods. According to the Icelander Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, the Vikings performed a grand ritual every 9 years, in which they sacrificed 9 living beings, men, horses, and other animals alike. These offerings were thought to ensure the health and prosperity of the land, as well as the favor of the gods. But what's particularly chilling is that these sacrifices were made in the presence of a massive sacred tree, said to be Yggdrasil itself, the Great World Tree, connecting the realms of gods and men. The idea of hanging human beings from the branches of a tree, offering them up as sacrifices to the gods, paints a disturbing picture, but it also reveals just how deep the Vikings' connection to their deities truly was. It's important to note that the accounts of these sacrifices are not without controversy. Historians still argue about the accuracy of Adam of Bremen's writings, which were based on second-hand accounts. Were the sacrifices real, or were they simply exaggerated by foreign scholars, trying to paint the Vikings as bloodthirsty savages? Archaeologists have found evidence of ritualistic burials and ceremonial weapons that might indicate the possibility of human sacrifice, but no definitive proof has ever emerged. Some scholars believe that Adam of Bremen's descriptions were more allegorical than factual, a means of emphasizing the barbaric nature of Viking culture through the lens of a Christian worldview. And yet, there are more subtle forms of human sacrifice that don't involve the dramatic scenes painted by foreign observers. Take, for example, the Viking burial mounds that have been uncovered across Scandinavia. In some of these graves, archaeologists have discovered evidence of ritualized deaths, slain individuals, often slaves or captives, buried alongside their masters. It's likely that these individuals were sacrificed As part of the burial rites, their deaths meant to accompany the spirit of the deceased into the afterlife. In some cases, the sacrifices were placed in graves near the deceased, while in others, they were buried in a manner that suggested a more ceremonial approach. The presence of these human remains, placed with such reverence, suggests that the Vikings believed in a kind of mutual sacrifice, an exchange between the living and the dead, where the deceased would carry the living spirit into the afterlife. In some cases, these sacrifices might have been a form of ritualized suicide, particularly for captives or slaves. The Vikings had a deeply ingrained code of honor and bravery, and some believed that by choosing death willingly, they could ensure their souls would be honored in the afterlife. A warrior who died in battle might be sent off with the utmost respect, but those who died under less glorious circumstances could be forced into death to fulfill the needs of the burial ceremony. Still, the true nature of these sacrifices remains a point of contention. Were they meant as a final act of loyalty to the deceased, or were they a way for the living to ensure that the dead would have the strength to face the unknown? We must also consider the role of Valkyries in these sacrifices. The Valkyries were the mythical female figures who chose which warriors would live and die on the battlefield, determining who would be granted access to Valhalla. But some scholars argue that the Valkyries might have also played a part in guiding the souls of the sacrificed individuals, ensuring that they made the journey safely to the afterlife. Could these sacrifices then have been offerings to the Valkyries, a way to show respect to these powerful female figures who were said to control the fate of men? As much as human sacrifice plays a role in Viking mythology, it's important to remember that not every burial featured this grisly practice. For many Vikings, their funerals were likely simpler affairs. Some were laid to rest in basic graves, with few, if any, adornments. In fact, many Vikings were buried in unmarked graves, their bodies left to return to the earth, without any form of ceremonial sacrifice. In the end, the vast majority of Viking burials might have been far less dramatic than the tales we've been told over the centuries. But the evidence we do have of human sacrifices, animal offerings, and symbolic rituals paints a powerful picture of a culture that deeply revered the afterlife. The Vikings believed that death was not an end, but a journey, and they were willing to go to great lengths to ensure their loved ones would travel well. With that in mind, we'll next delve into the role of women in Viking funerary practices, exploring how their involvement in these rites reveals deeper insights into Viking beliefs about death status and the afterlife. As the sun sets behind the horizon, a sense of quiet reverence fills the air, and the soft rustling of the wind reminds you of the sacredness of this moment. The Vikings, with their deep respect for both life and death, had complex views about gender, and this was reflected in their burial customs. While Viking burial sites often conjure images of powerful warriors being laid to rest in grand ship burials, or with ceremonial swords, there's another important and often overlooked aspect of Viking funerary practices: the role of women. Women in Viking society were more than just wives and mothers. They were also key figures in the rituals surrounding death and burial. Their involvement in funerary practices was crucial, not only as mourners, but also as active participants in ensuring the safe passage of the deceased to the afterlife. Contrary to the image of Viking society as a purely male-dominated warrior culture, women held significant spiritual and ritualistic authority. This is particularly evident in the graves of high-status women, which sometimes contained items or symbols, indicating their role in guiding souls or ensuring that the right sacrifices were made. Take, for example, the Oseberg ship burial, one of the most famous Viking archaeological finds. In this grave, 2 women were buried in a large, intricately decorated ship. But the burial wasn't just about status, it was about the role these women played in the Viking world. Alongside their bodies, a wealth of goods was found, including finely crafted textiles tools and religious artifacts. What's particularly intriguing is that some of these items were clearly meant for ritual use, suggesting that these women had been involved in spiritual practices, possibly as priestesses or ritual leaders. Their graves hint at a more nuanced role for women in Viking culture, one that was deeply connected to the afterlife and the gods. Historians still argue about the specific roles of women in Viking religion and burial rites. Some scholars suggest that women were primarily seen as the keepers of the hearth, the guardians of home and family, but they also had a vital role in the spiritual and ceremonial life of the tribe. This connection to spirituality is evidenced by the Valkyries, the warrior women of Norse mythology, who were believed to choose who would live and die on the battlefield. While the Valkyries were mythical figures, they may have reflected real, powerful women who wielded authority over life-death and the warrior code. It's possible that these women were seen as intermediaries between the mortal world and the divine, helping to guide souls to the afterlife. Another fascinating element of Viking burials that involves women is the idea of grave goods. Often, a Viking woman would be buried with items that reflected her role in life, but also those that were thought to aid her in the afterlife. In some cases, this included tools of domestic life, like spindles and weaving tools, but in others, it included more spiritual or ritualistic items, such as amulets, pendants, and even small altars. These grave goods suggest that the Vikings saw women not only as individuals with personal value, but also as essential participants in the spiritual economy of the afterlife. A woman's burial could reflect her status as a household goddess, someone who was expected to continue her duties in the next world, whether it was keeping the fire burning or helping guide the deceased through their journey. Interestingly, some Viking burial sites indicate that women were also associated with sacred rituals that involved death and rebirth. One of the most famous examples is the vulva, a kind of female shaman or seeress. These women were believed to have special powers to communicate with the gods and spirits. Some scholars argue that the vulvas had an especially significant role during burials, perhaps performing rituals or ceremonies to ensure the deceased's spirit was properly honored. In fact, the word vulva itself means wandering woman, and it's likely that these women traveled from settlement to settlement, offering their services to those in need of spiritual guidance. The vulvas were powerful figures, and their presence in Viking burials would have been seen as both a sign of respect for the deceased and a way of ensuring that the proper rituals were followed. There's also the fascinating case of the Viking warrior women who were buried with weapons and armor, leading to much debate about their role in Viking society. Some of these women were buried in graves that were distinctly martial in nature. Swords, shields, and other weaponry were placed beside their bodies, while these graves were sometimes associated with women of high status or those in leadership roles. Some archaeologists believe these women may have been warriors themselves. The idea of women warriors isn't as fantastical as it sounds. Viking society valued strength, bravery, and martial skill, and women who demonstrated these traits were not unheard of. The evidence suggests that these women could have been warriors, or even spiritual guides who were seen as capable of protecting the dead in their journey to the afterlife. While many Viking burial sites feature men with their swords and shields, the graves of women with such items suggest that Viking women may have been seen as equally capable of playing a key role in both life and death. And perhaps this is why Viking women were also among the most revered figures in Norse mythology, because they embodied the very qualities of power, endurance, and wisdom that Viking society held dear. Their ability to influence both the mortal and spiritual worlds made them key figures in ensuring that death was not an end, but a transition into something greater. As we move forward, we'll explore the often overlooked practice of burial without burial goods. Some Vikings were laid to rest with very few possessions, and these burials raise intriguing questions about status, spirituality, and the afterlife. What did these minimalist graves reveal about Viking attitudes toward death and the soul? As the night deepens, the moonlight glints off the edge of a distant grave, casting long shadows over the earth. Here the air is still, and a quiet unease lingers. Not every Viking burial was marked by the grand array of treasures we often associate with their culture. In fact, some graves were startlingly simple, devoid of the wealth, the weapons, or the ceremonial goods found in other burials. But this absence of material offerings isn't an oversight. It's a statement. The Vikings, in their belief system, didn't always think that objects or riches were necessary to accompany the dead into the afterlife. Some were buried with nothing at all. These minimalist burials offer us a window into the complex beliefs of a people who saw death not just as a physical end, but as a transition between worlds. So what do these simple graves tell us? It seems that for some individuals, particularly those of lower status, the afterlife wasn't something to be bought with gold or riches. Instead, it was believed that the soul itself would provide all that was needed on its journey. And while the wealthier Vikings may have been laid to rest with weapons, tools, and even pets, others might have been buried with little more than a simple shroud, or the occasional token, like a small knife or a fragment of pottery. In fact, a notable trend among these minimalist graves is that they sometimes contain personal items, not treasures, but objects that were important to the deceased in life, such as clothing, a favorite tool, or a family heirloom. These were the things the person had used regularly, the things they held dear, and perhaps the things they would need in the afterlife. Historians have debated for years the significance of these no-frills burials. Some suggest that the lack of grave goods indicated a lower social status, while others argue that the simplicity of the grave was a reflection of the individual's beliefs about death. After all, not everyone was a warrior or noble, and it's possible that for some Vikings, the afterlife wasn't about material wealth, but spiritual readiness. If a person was believed to have lived a life full of honor and respect, perhaps they didn't need the gold, the weapons, or the adornments of the elite. Instead, they would be guided to the afterlife by their deeds, their relationships with others, and their personal connection to the gods. Yet, there's a fascinating and somewhat eerie side to these simple graves. While the grave goods might have been minimal, the placement of the body in these burials was often highly deliberate. In some cases, the dead were placed in prone positions, meaning they were laid flat on their backs, arms by their sides, with their heads pointing toward the setting sun. This wasn't a random arrangement. It was a position that symbolized the deceased's departure from this world and their readiness to face whatever came next. In other graves, the body was placed in a fetal position, suggesting that the individual was returning to a womb-like state, prepared for rebirth into the next world. These burial practices, though seemingly simple, reveal a rich and complex philosophy of death, one that goes beyond material wealth. It's also worth noting that some of the simplest graves were found in unmarked cemeteries, where the deceased were buried without any special memorial epitaph or marker to indicate their identity. This could be the case for lower status individuals, like slaves, farmers, or craftsmen, whose deaths didn't warrant the extravagant rituals reserved for kings or warriors. And yet, even in these humble graves, there was a sense of dignity. These were the graves of people who had lived and worked, and who, like their elite counterparts, were on their own journey to the afterlife. The lack of monumental markers didn't diminish the value of the life that was lived. It simply reflected the practicality of Viking society. Despite the simplicity, these burials were not without meaning. Archaeologists have discovered tokens of affection buried alongside the deceased in minimalist graves, such as a child's favorite toy or a personal ornament. These items were often humble, but they were deeply personal. They represented a bond between the living and the dead, a way for the survivors to ensure that their loved one had something familiar on their journey. The inclusion of such items suggests that, even without gold or grand ceremonial objects, the emotional and spiritual significance of the burial was paramount. In Viking society, there was a belief in the cyclical nature of life and death. Many of the minimalist graves were found in ancient cemeteries that had been used for generations. The Vikings saw themselves as part of an ongoing, uninterrupted continuum. Death wasn't an end. It was simply a transition to the next stage of the cycle. This view of death as cyclical is mirrored in the burial practices of the pre-Christian Norse, who often practiced cremation, or in the case of some Viking leaders' ship burials, for those who were laid to rest in simpler graves. The focus wasn't on the material wealth they left behind. It was on the legacy they carried with them. Historians still argue whether these minimalist burials were truly indicative of low status or simply reflected the differing spiritual beliefs of the individual and their family. There is evidence to suggest that Viking burials weren't as rigidly hierarchical as one might assume. In fact, some high-status individuals were buried in simple graves, possibly as a personal choice, an expression of their beliefs, or even as a sign of humility. So while we may assume that lavish grave goods always equated to high rank, the reality is that Viking burial customs were far more complex and nuanced. Moving forward, we'll explore the intriguing topic of Viking ship burials, where wealth status and ritual intersected in powerful and haunting ways. These grand burials have long captured the imagination of modern audiences, and their mysteries reveal more about Viking spirituality and the lengths they went to ensure that the deceased were sent off properly. As the night deepens further, a calm, almost surreal silence envelops the land. You're near the coast now, where the sea stretches endlessly, its dark waves shimmering in the starlight. You can almost feel the rhythm of the tides, the same tides that carried the Viking ships across distant shores. It's here by the sea that one of the most awe-inspiring Viking burial practices took place, the ship burial. These monumental rituals where the dead were sent off in grandeur, tell us much about the Vikings' view of death, the afterlife, and their societal values. Imagine a Viking warrior, perhaps a chieftain or a king, lying in state on a grand ship, his body dressed in fine clothes, might be surrounded by treasures, gold, weapons, and tools items that he would need in the next life. A team of mourners would gather around performing rites and offering sacrifices to ensure that the deceased's journey was peaceful and protected. The ship itself, often a symbol of status and power, was just as important as the treasures. For the Vikings, the ship wasn't merely a vessel for travel. It was a symbol of the journey to the afterlife, a vessel that would carry the dead across the waters of the spiritual realm. The most famous example of Viking ship burial is the Oseberg ship discovered in 1904 in Norway. This ship, which dates back to the early 9th century, was remarkably well preserved. It had been buried with 2 women who were likely high-status individuals, as well as a host of grave goods. These included textiles, ceremonial items, and even household tools, all meticulously arranged to accompany the deceased on their journey. The ship itself, nearly 22 meters long, was a masterpiece of Viking craftsmanship, with intricate carvings and delicate details. But beyond the craftsmanship, the Oseberg ship burial offers a glimpse into Viking beliefs about death. For them, sending the deceased off on a ship wasn't just a practical matter, it was an act of cosmic significance. Historians still debate the exact significance of ship burials. Were they reserved for high-status individuals, or were they a more widespread practice? The evidence suggests that ship burials were not reserved for kings alone, but were also used for chieftains, wealthy warriors, and even some women of high standing. However, the Oseberg ship is unique in that it suggests the possibility that Viking women also enjoyed certain rights and privileges when it came to death and burial. This challenges the notion that Viking society was solely focused on male warriors and suggests that the Vikings recognized the power and importance of women in both life and death. But why ships? Why were they so central to Viking burial practices? For the Vikings, ships represented travel adventure and the crossing of thresholds. The Vikings believed that the afterlife was a journey, one that could take the soul to places far beyond this world, perhaps even to Valhalla, the hall of the slain, or heal the realm of the dead. The idea of the ship as a vehicle for the soul made sense to them. Just as the ship carried them across oceans in life, it would carry their souls across the afterlife's waters. The notion of the sea as a boundary between worlds, a place where the living and the dead met, was central to Viking cosmology. The sea, in a way, was both a literal and symbolic path to the afterlife. Some Viking ship burials were also accompanied by cremations, where the body was burned before being placed on the ship. This could be done either on land or by setting the ship alight and letting it drift out to sea. The burning of the ship was thought to release the soul, allowing it to travel freely. The idea of cremation, with its ties to fire and transformation, fits into the broader Viking belief that death was not an end, but a transition. The soul released by the fire would be free to journey onward, perhaps to join the gods, or be reborn in another form. This act of burning also symbolized purification and renewal, a common theme in Viking spiritual practices. What's particularly fascinating about these ship burials is that they were not just for the individual. In some cases, the ship was accompanied by sacrificial offerings. These could include human sacrifices, usually slaves, servants, were sometimes captives taken in battle, or animals like horses or dogs. The presence of these sacrifices suggests that the Vikings believed in companionship for the deceased in the afterlife. The dead would not journey alone. They would be accompanied by those who had served them in life. These offerings were thought to ensure the deceased's success and protection in the afterlife. Much like the warriors in Valhalla were believed to be watched over by Valkyries. However, not all ship burials involved human sacrifices. In some cases, the grave was simply filled with symbolic offerings. For example, the Gokstad ship, another famous Viking burial site, contained a rich collection of weapons tools and domestic items. It's clear from these finds that the Vikings didn't view their deceased as simply gone. Rather, they saw them as people continuing on a journey, one that required supplies, support, and protection. The ship, along with the accompanying grave goods, was the vehicle for that journey, a sacred, tangible representation of the transition from life to death. But as with many aspects of Viking funerary practices, the ship burial's true meaning remains elusive. Some scholars argue that the ship was meant to represent the deceased's final journey as a warrior or leader, while others suggest that it symbolized a broader spiritual journey, one that transcended the earthly world. Still, others believe that ship burials were simply a practical matter. The Vikings lived by the sea and had a close connection to boats and ships, so it made sense for them to bury their dead in vessels they knew and revered. This brings us back to the debate over the role of burial goods in Viking graves. Were they material possessions meant to help the deceased in the afterlife? Or were they symbolic representations of the Viking belief in transformation and transition? In our next section, we'll discuss how Viking burial practices were influenced by the changing dynamics of Viking society, especially as they came into contact with Christian practices. This shift would eventually lead to a significant change in how the Vikings viewed death burial and the afterlife. As the wind picks up and the scent of salt water fills the air, the rhythm of the tide reminds you of the cyclical nature of Viking life and death. But just as the tides ebb and flow, so too did Viking burial practices. Over time, the Vikings who had once been so entrenched in their pagan beliefs about death and the afterlife began to experience a shift in how they treated their dead. This shift, largely influenced by Christianity, was one of the most profound changes to Viking burial customs. As the Viking Age progressed, the influence of Christianity became impossible to ignore. By the 10th century, Christian missionaries had begun to make their way to the Nordic lands, and with them, they brought a new vision of the afterlife. Gone were the warrior feasts of Valhalla, the spirit journeys across the sea, and the belief in eternal life through battle and bravery. In their place, Christianity offered a more spiritualized view of the afterlife, one that emphasized salvation, forgiveness, and the hope of an eternal life in heaven. You might imagine that this would have been a jarring change for the Vikings, who were so deeply connected to the earth, the sea, and the gods. And indeed it was. Viking burial customs didn't just change overnight. Instead, there was a period of transition where Christian elements were slowly woven into existing Viking funeral rites. For instance, Christian symbols like the cross began appearing on Viking gravestones, and prayers for the deceased became more common, though they were often mixed with traditional Viking rituals. But the most obvious change was the shift away from the grand ship burials of old. As the Vikings converted to Christianity, they began to bury their dead in simpler graves, without the grand ships, without the treasures, and without the lavish displays of wealth. Instead of sending the deceased off on a ship to sail into the afterlife, they were often laid to rest in stone-lined graves, sometimes with just a simple wooden cross marking their place. This shift away from ship burials was both a practical change. Christianity didn't require such elaborate burials, and a theological one. Christian beliefs about death and the afterlife didn't necessitate the same kinds of material offerings. This change was part of a broader cultural transformation. In the early Viking period, there had been a clear association between death and the power of the warrior. The grave, especially the ship burial, was a reflection of the deceased's status accomplishments and role in life. But as Christianity spread, the focus began to shift from material wealth and warrior status to the soul's salvation. For the Christian Vikings, burial practices became less about ensuring victory in the afterlife and more about ensuring peace and rest for the soul. Historians still debate how long this transition took. Some argue that ship burials persisted into the 11th century, long after Christianity had officially taken hold. For example, the burial of Olaf Tryggvason, a king who converted to Christianity in the late 10th century, may have involved a ship burial, though details remain murky. Others suggest that by the mid-10th century, ship burials had largely disappeared, replaced by simpler Christian burials. This shift also marked the end of the Vikings' obsession with warrior culture as a central feature of their identity. As Christianity took root, the afterlife became less about physical valor and more about spiritual purity. But while Viking burial practices became simpler, they didn't become entirely devoid of the old ways. Even as Viking societies embraced Christian funerals, many of the old beliefs about death and the soul remained intact. For example, many Vikings were still buried with personal items like tools, clothing, or a favorite piece of jewelry items that had once been seen as necessary for the deceased's journey across the sea, now simply seen as reflections of the life they had led. In fact, the practice of burying personal items with the dead continued for several centuries, even as the grandeur of ship burials faded into history. Interestingly, the location of Viking graves also began to change with the arrival of Christianity. Christian cemeteries were often located near churches, whereas older Viking graves were sometimes found in isolated burial mounds or near waterways. This shift symbolized a change in how the dead were viewed. No longer were the dead thought to be embarking on a journey to the farthest reaches of the world. Instead, they were now believed to rest in peace, awaiting the resurrection on Judgment Day. The Christian burial practice also emphasized the notion of a more private, solemn resting place, reflecting a view of death as a peaceful transition rather than a perilous voyage. The Viking conversion to Christianity wasn't a uniform experience. The process was uneven, often involving gradual adaptation rather than outright rejection of traditional beliefs. In some regions, Viking communities may have held on to their old customs, even as they nominally adopted Christianity. Archaeological evidence from burial sites reveals that some graves from this period contain both Christian symbols, like crosses, and Viking items, like weapons, suggesting that the Vikings had an eclectic and syncretic approach to death rituals. What's particularly fascinating is that even as the Vikings adopted Christian burial practices, there was a lingering belief in the power of burial sites. Viking graves continued to be seen as places of spiritual significance, but the spirits of the dead were now viewed less as continuing their journey across the seas, and more as guardians of the land. These graves were marked by a certain reverence, often preserved by the community, as places of memory and ancestral veneration. As we move toward the final section, we'll reflect on the legacy of Viking burial practices in the modern world. From archaeological discoveries to popular myths, the fascination with Viking burials continues to influence our view of these people. In some ways, the mystique surrounding Viking burials still keeps the door open for new interpretations and revelations about what these ancient practices can teach us about life, death, and memory. As you stand in the soft moonlight, you can almost feel the whispers of the past brushing against you like a cool breeze rolling off the sea. The burial mounds the ships, the treasures these elements of Viking death rituals have long captured our imaginations. Their funerary practices were intricate, revealing a great deal about how the Vikings viewed life, death, and the beyond. And yet, despite the centuries that have passed, these ancient rituals still hold an enduring mystique. The legacy of Viking burial customs isn't just confined to the archaeological record. It's woven into modern storytelling, and it continues to shape how we understand the Vikings. The influence of Viking burial rituals can be seen in a variety of ways today, from popular culture to modern-day archaeology. In the world of literature and film, the Viking funeral has become an iconic image. Think of the many movies, books, and TV shows where a Viking warrior is sent off in a blazing ship, drifting out to sea, never to return. These images, though often sensationalized or romanticized, tap into a deep cultural resonance. The Viking ship burial represents a transition, a passage not just into the afterlife, but into legend. In the end, it is not the wealth or weapons that make the Vikings' journey so poignant, but the idea that death was a continuation of the warrior's journey, a final adventure across realms. And yet beneath the myth, there's something deeply human in these burial practices. The Vikings, despite their fierce reputation as seafarers and warriors, were also a people deeply concerned with legacy. What remains after we're gone? The Vikings believed that part of their legacy could be preserved in the way they were buried, and the grave goods they were sent off with. But more importantly, the burial itself was a ritual of remembrance. It wasn't just about sending the dead off. It was about marking their place in the world. And for the Vikings, that meant ensuring that the stories of their lives would be carried forward to us, passed down through generations. This focus on remembrance is still present today, albeit in a less tangible form. Think about the way we remember our own ancestors. Many cultures still have rituals to honor the dead, even if those rituals look very different from those of the Vikings. But in some ways, we are all trying to do what the Vikings did to ensure that the people who came before us aren't forgotten. Whether it's through gravestones, memorials, or simply the stories we tell, the urge to remember and honor the dead is universal. Yet the question of legacy isn't just about the dead. It's about the living. The Vikings were aware of how the rituals of death spoke to the lives they had lived. Through their burial practices, they were saying something about their values, beliefs, and connections. Whether through extravagant ship burials, minimalist graves, or the mixing of old and new traditions, the Vikings made sure that their practices reflected the world in which they lived. And in doing so, they gave us a glimpse into the heart of their culture. As we look at the archaeological sites today, we continue to uncover new aspects of Viking burial customs. The discoveries made in places like Oseberg Gokstad and Birka have given us remarkable insight into Viking life and death. But there's still so much more to learn. For instance, the ongoing analysis of human remains found in Viking graves continues to provide answers about diet health and even the roles of women in Viking society. The Vikings, it seems, are never truly gone. Every new discovery is a piece of the puzzle, a link that connects us to these people who lived more than 1,000 years ago. Historians and archaeologists still argue over many aspects of Viking burial practices. Some aspects, like the role of women in Viking society, continue to be topics of hot debate. Were Viking women warriors? What was their role in the afterlife? Were they given equal importance in death as they were in life? As our understanding of the Vikings deepens, these questions continue to fuel curiosity, and the mysteries of their burials remain an ongoing source of intrigue. But it's not just the facts and figures that continue to captivate us. It's the stories. The Vikings were a people who lived boldly and bravely, and their death rituals reflected that same spirit. They didn't just bury their dead. They gave them a send-off that was rich in meaning, ritual, and story. Every Viking burial was an act of storytelling, where the deceased's life was honored and their legacy ensured. Now, as the night draws to a close, the wind seems to carry with it a gentle reminder that death, like life, is a journey. For the Vikings, it was a journey that didn't end with their burial. It was just the beginning of a new adventure. Whether through grand ship burials or simpler graves, their death rituals were about the continuity of life. And perhaps, in the end, that's what all of us seek in our own way. A way to be remembered, a way to carry our stories forward, and a way to ensure that the journey, even in death, is never truly over. So with this thought, let the gentle waves of time carry you to a place of rest. As the Vikings once did, let your journey tonight be peaceful, with the knowledge that we too leave behind stories to be told.